Combat specialist Aria flexed her talons against the drop pod's restraints as the craft shuddered through Earth's atmosphere. Through the viewport, the continent below stretched endlessly, red dirt, sparse vegetation, nothing that suggested meaningful resistance. Her tactical display showed scattered human settlements, primitive infrastructure, no military installations worth mentioning. Easy planetary subjugation, she muttered, checking her plasma rifle one final time. The Dominion had conquered 12 worlds in the past cycle. Earth would be number 13. The drop pod slammed into the ground with bone-jarring force, and Aria's squad of 6 elite soldiers deployed in perfect formation. Their dark exoskeletons gleamed in the harsh sunlight, bio-enhanced muscles coiled for action. Each warrior stood 7 feet tall and could bench press a small transport vehicle. "Perimeter secure," reported Vex, her lieutenant, scanning the empty grassland with thermal sensors. No immediate threats detected. That's when the first kangaroo appeared. It hopped into view about 50 meters away, a massive red male that stood chest-high to Aria's warriors. She'd read the intelligence files. Earth's marsupials were supposed to be docile herbivores, evolutionary relics too stupid to fear superior predators. The kangaroo stopped, tilted its head, and stared directly at her squad. "Curious local fauna," Vex noted. "Should we collect a specimen?" Before Aria could answer, 3 more kangaroos emerged from behind scattered bushes, then 6 more, then 12. Within minutes, her squad was surrounded by nearly 30 of the creatures, all standing unnaturally still, all watching her soldiers with an intelligence that made her neck scales prickle. "I don't like this," murmured Kex from her left flank. "They're behaving like." The big red male suddenly reared up on its hind legs, balancing on its thick tail, and let out a sound that was part growl, part challenge. Every other kangaroo in the mob immediately copied the gesture. "They're displaying," Aria realized with growing unease, "territorial display behavior." "Against us," Vex's voice carried disbelief. "We're apex predators." "They're grass-eating." The lead kangaroo launched itself forward like a furry missile. Aria had fought Thanagarian shock troops and Proximan acid spitters. She'd survived 3 planetary invasions and earned commendations for combat excellence. Nothing in her training had prepared her for the sight of a 6-foot kangaroo closing distance at 30 miles per hour, massive hind legs pumping, forelimbs extended like a boxer's guard. "Neutralized target," she barked. Vex raised his plasma rifle, but the kangaroo was already too close. It slammed into the 7-foot warrior with the force of a battering ram, massive hind legs pistoning forward in a devastating kick that caught Vex's centermass. The impact lifted him off his feet and sent him flying 12 meters through the air to crash in a heap of twisted armor plates. That was the signal the rest of the mob had been waiting for. Chaos erupted across the landing site. Kangaroos bounded forward from all directions, their powerful legs covering ground with terrifying speed. Aria's supposedly elite warriors, trained to face the galaxy's deadliest opponents, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the fury of Earth's hopping lawn mowers. Kex managed to get off 2 plasma bolts before a large female caught him with a haymaker punch that dented his helmet and sent him spinning. Track tried to use his enhanced strength to grapple with a smaller male, only to discover that kangaroos fought dirty. The marsupial wrapped its forelimbs around Track's torso like a wrestler, then delivered a series of rabbit punches to his kidney area that made him howl and drop his guard. "Fall back," Aria shouted, discharging her weapon into the air to scatter the attackers. The energy bolts barely seemed to register with the kangaroos. If anything, the sound made them more aggressive. The retreat lasted exactly 30 seconds before the mob caught up again. Aria watched in stunned horror as her most decorated soldiers, warriors who'd faced down mechanized infantry and orbital bombardments, ran screaming from a group of animals that looked like they should be in a children's story. The kangaroos pursued with relentless determination, bounding along like furry engines of destruction, occasionally pausing to deliver devastating kicks to any warrior who stumbled. "This is Delta Squad requesting immediate extraction," she gasped into her comm unit, dodging a particularly aggressive male who seemed personally offended by her presence. "We have completely misassessed local fauna threat levels." "Negative, Delta Squad," came the reply from orbit. "Intelligence indicates Earth herbivores pose minimal threat. Continue mission parameters." A kangaroo the size of a small vehicle chose that moment to demonstrate its boxing skills on her communications officer, reducing both the soldier and his equipment to a pile of dented metal and groaning alien. "Command, the herbivores are winning." Static was her only answer. That's when she heard the laughter. Human laughter coming from somewhere behind the tree line. Aria spun around, plasma rifle raised, and saw a figure approaching on foot, a human male in dusty work clothes, wide-brimmed hat, and boots that had seen better decades. He was walking toward the chaos with the casual confidence of someone taking an evening stroll, and he was grinning like this was the best entertainment he'd seen in years. "G'day," he called out, tipping his hat. "Name's Cody. You folks seem to be having a bit of trouble with the locals." Aria stared at him in disbelief. Her elite warriors were being systematically dismantled by Earth's supposedly peaceful wildlife, and this human was treating it like a sporting event. "Assistance," she managed, dodging another kangaroo. "Require immediate assistance." Cody scratched his chin thoughtfully, watching as one of her soldiers tried to escape by climbing a tree, only to have a large male kangaroo follow him up with embarrassing ease. "Well, see, that's your first problem right there," he said conversationally. "You landed right in Big Red's territory during mating season. The boys are all worked up and ready to scrap with anything that looks like competition." "Competition," Aria's voice cracked. "We're technologically superior life forms." "Sure, but you're also about the same size as a rival male kangaroo. You're wearing what looks like fancy armor, and you came stomping into their home ground making a lot of noise." Cody shrugged. "From their perspective, you're either claiming territory or trying to steal their Sheilas. Either way, them's fighting words." Another one of her warriors went flying past, courtesy of a kangaroo kick that would have shattered human bones. "How do we make them stop?" she pleaded. Cody considered this, watching the ongoing melee with professional interest. "Well, you've got a few options. You can keep running until they get bored, might take a few hours. You can try to fight them one-on-one, but I wouldn't recommend that unless you fancy getting your armor turned into abstract art. Or," he paused dramatically, "or, you can let me teach you the local rules of engagement. See, living with these fellas takes a bit of know-how. There's ways to move, ways to act, ways to show respect that won't get you turned into a punching bag." Aria looked at her decimated squad, then back at the human, who was somehow completely unfazed by the mayhem around them. "You would help us. Mate, this is the most entertainment I've had since the last B&S ball. Course I'll help, but first," he held up a finger, "you need to call off whatever backup you've got planned. These roos are protective of their territory, but they're not unreasonable. Start dropping orbital strikes or bringing in the heavy gear, and you'll have every mob from here to Darwin coming to join the party." Aria hesitated. Her training said never trust the enemy. Her current situation said her training hadn't accounted for Earth's unique circumstances. "Very well," she said, keying her comm to broadcast on all frequencies. "All Dominion forces stand down. Delta Squad is negotiating with local resources." Cody's grin widened. "Right then. Lesson 1, when you see a big male kangaroo, never ever look him direct in the eyes. That's a challenge, and around here, challenges get answered." As if to demonstrate, one of her remaining soldiers made the mistake of staring down a particularly large male. The kangaroo immediately reared up on its hind legs and began pounding its chest like an organic war drum. "Oh, Zex is about to learn the hard way," Aria muttered. Lesson 2, Cody continued calmly, as Zex learned exactly why kangaroos were called nature's boxers. "Always respect the creek. See, roos like to drink at water sources and they get real territorial about them. You want to water up, you wait your turn and approach slow and peaceful like." And lesson 3. Cody's expression grew serious. "Never, ever corner a kangaroo near water. They can't go backwards, so they'll fight to the death rather than give ground. And trust me, mate, in a fair fight between a determined roo and anything that walks on 2 legs, smart money's on the roo." Aria watched as the kangaroo mob gradually settled down, acknowledging that the invaders had been properly educated in local customs. Her warriors limped back into formation, armor dented, pride considerably more damage than their equipment. "Your species," she said slowly, "coexists with these combat herbivores." "Coexist," Cody laughed. "Mate, we share the roads with them. They bounce across highways during morning commute. Kids play footy in paddocks where roos graze. Most folks have stories about finding a big male in their backyard pool or having to shoo a mob away from their vegetable garden. But they're formidable opponents. Too right they are. That's why you learn to live with them, not against them. See, the thing about Australia is, pretty much everything here will try to kill you if you're stupid about it. The trick isn't avoiding danger, it's understanding it, respecting it, and finding your place in the ecosystem." Aria's tactical computers were struggling to process this information. Your species evolved alongside apex predators. Apex predators venomous everything, plants that'll burn your skin off, whether that swings from drought to flood to bushfire depending on the season. Cody ticked off items on his fingers. We didn't just evolve alongside dangerous things, love. We learned to thrive because of them. One of the kangaroos, the big red male who'd started the fight, approached cautiously. Cody stood perfectly still, not making eye contact, letting the massive marsupial sniff around him before giving a respectful nod and hopping away. See, he's just checking to make sure we understand the ground rules. No worries. Aria stared at the human who just calmly negotiated with what her combat assessment classified as violent megafauna. You're not afraid of them. Course not, fear's what gets you hurt out here. Respect, on the other hand, that keeps you alive. These fellas aren't monsters, they're just neighbors with very clear boundaries and the equipment to enforce them. Equipment. Mate, a big red male can kick with about 850 pounds of force, hop at 35 miles per hour, and box like a prizefighter. Plus they've got claws that can open you up like a can and the temper of an angry drunk after a 3-day bender. Cody grinned. So yeah, equipment. Aria was quiet for a long moment, watching her supposedly elite soldiers nurse their wounded pride and dented armor. Perhaps, she said carefully, we underestimated this planet's defensive capabilities. Well, you lot certainly underestimated the welcoming committee, but hey, that's what learning's for, right? Stick around long enough and I'll introduce you to some of the really dangerous locals. There are worse things than combat kangaroos. Cody's expression grew thoughtful. Ever met a cassowary? Hey. Cassowary? Aria repeated, not liking the way Cody's expression had shifted from amused to genuinely concerned. 6-foot-tall flightless bird, prehistoric-looking thing with a bone helmet on its head and claws that can gut a crocodile. Well, let's just say kangaroos are reasonable. Cassowaries take everything personally. Aria's scales rippled with unease, and your species coexists with these as well. Up north in Queensland, yeah. Though coexist is a strong word, more like carefully avoid while treating them like the living dinosaurs they are. Cody scratched his stubble. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, you've got bigger problems than theoretical bird encounters. Bigger problems. Cody pointed toward the horizon, where dust clouds were rising like signals across the red landscape. Word travels fast out here. You just picked a fight with the Mackenzie Creek mob, and that's going to get around. Every kangaroo group between here and the river is going to hear about the strangers who couldn't follow basic manners. Aria's tactical display was struggling to interpret the movement patterns, but even she could see that multiple groups were converging on their position. Her remaining 5 warriors were in no condition for another encounter. They're coordinating, she asked weakly. Not exactly coordinating, more like curious. See, roos are social animals. When one mob has an interesting encounter, others want to see what's what. Nothing spreads faster than a good story about putting some upstart strangers in their place. Vex limped over, his left arm hanging at an odd angle and his helmet sporting a dent shaped like a kangaroo fist. Commander, Orbital Command is requesting status update. They want to know why we haven't secured the landing zone. Aria looked at her battered squad, then at the approaching dust clouds, then at the human who seemed completely unfazed by the prospect of facing multiple mobs of combat marsupials. Tell Command we're engaged in cultural exchange protocols. Cultural exchange. That's what this is, right? She asked Cody hopefully. Oh, absolutely, very intensive cultural exchange. The kind where you learn really fast or get bounced around the paddock like a rubber ball. He studied the approaching dust clouds with professional interest. Right, here's what we're going to do. First, all weapons down, completely down. You're about to meet the Billabong mob, the Red Hill crew, and possibly the Sunset Ridge family. They're coming to see if you've learned your manners or if you need another lesson. Down weapons in the face of hostiles, Vex protested. Mate, they're not hostiles, they're neighbors having a look at the new folks. Big difference. Cody's tone grew serious, but if you keep treating them like enemies, that's exactly what they'll become. And trust me, you don't want that. Aria considered her options. Her combat assessment said this was tactical suicide. Her current situation said her combat assessment was approximately as useful as armor made of tissue paper. Weapons down, she ordered. Her squad complied reluctantly, plasma rifles hitting the dirt with soft thumps. Almost immediately, the tension in the air seemed to ease. The approaching kangaroos maintained their steady pace but no longer moved with the aggressive bounds that had characterized the earlier encounter. Good instincts, Cody nodded approvingly. Now when they arrive, here's the protocol. Stand still, don't make eye contact, let them sniff around if they want to, and for the love of all that's holy, don't try to pet them. Pet them. You'd be amazed how many tourists try that. Kangaroos aren't dogs. They're wild animals with personal space issues and the ability to express their displeasure through interpretive violence. The first of the new arrivals hopped into view, a group of 5 large greys led by a female who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. She approached the landing site cautiously, examining the scattered equipment and dented armor with obvious intelligence. "That's old Sheila," Cody murmured, "matriarch of the Billabong mob. She's been running that crew for about 8 years now. Smart as a whip and tough as old boots." Old Sheila completed her circuit of the landing zone, then approached Aria directly. The kangaroo was smaller than the big red male who'd started the fight, but something in her posture suggested that size wasn't everything when it came to authority. "She's evaluating you," Cody whispered, "trying to figure out if you're a threat, territorial competition, or just really confused tourists." Aria stood perfectly still as the matriarch sniffed delicately at her armor, occasionally reaching out with one forepaw to test the unfamiliar material. The kangaroo's dark eyes held an intelligence that was frankly unsettling. This wasn't the vacant stare of prey animals, but the calculating assessment of someone making important decisions. After what felt like an eternity, old Sheila stepped back and made a soft, chuffing sound. The rest of her mob relaxed visibly. "Congratulations," Cody grinned, "you just passed inspection. She's decided you're harmless, but probably too dumb to survive without supervision." "Is that good?" "Mate, that's the best possible outcome. You've gone from territorial threat to confused tourist. That's a significant upgrade in local social standing." More groups were arriving now, the Red Hill crew Cody had mentioned, along with what appeared to be several family units of various sizes. Within minutes, the landing site had become something resembling a community gathering, with kangaroos of all ages hopping around, investigating the strange new arrivals, and apparently gossiping about the morning's entertainment. "This is remarkable," Aria found herself saying. "They're exhibiting complex social behaviors, territorial organization, information sharing. Yeah, they're pretty switched on. Most folks don't give them credit for how clever they are. See that little Joey there?" He pointed to a young kangaroo peering out from its mother's pouch. "He's taking notes, learning how to deal with weird strangers. In a few years, he'll be passing on those lessons to his own kids." Aria's warrior training was struggling with the concept of treating potential combat targets as individuals with personalities and social structures. "Your intelligence reports don't mention any of this complexity." "What intelligence reports?" "The Dominion reconnaissance files on Earth's fauna, detailed behavioral assessments, threat evaluations, ecological impact studies." Cody looked genuinely puzzled. "Mate, who exactly did your intelligence gathering?" "Our long-range observational satellites and automated probe surveys, standard protocols for pre-invasion assessment." Understanding dawned on Cody's face. "Right. So you've been watching from space and sending in robots to take measurements. The most efficient methodology for completely missing the point," Cody interrupted gently. "You can't understand Australia from orbit, love. Hell, you can't understand it from the tourist trail. This place only makes sense when you get down in the dirt and live with it for a while." A young male kangaroo was examining Vex's damaged helmet with obvious curiosity, occasionally poking at the dents with one claw. "He's trying to figure out what did that damage," Cody explained, "probably wondering if whatever hit your mate is still around and whether he needs to be worried about it. The damage was caused by one of his relatives." "Yeah, but he doesn't know that. All he sees is evidence that something big and unfriendly happened in his neighborhood, natural enough to be curious about it." Aria was beginning to understand why the Dominion's intelligence assessments had been so catastrophically wrong. They'd been observing Earth's landscape and wildlife from the perspective of conquerors, cataloging resources and obstacles. They'd never considered that they might need to learn the rules of someone else's home. "Cody," she said carefully, "hypothetically speaking, if an advanced spacefaring civilization wanted to establish cooperative relations with Earth's inhabitants, what would you recommend?" Cody's eyebrows shot up. "Hypothetically speaking." "Entirely hypothetical." He glanced around at the peaceful gathering of kangaroos, then at her battered squad, then back at her. "Well, hypothetically, I'd say step 1 would be acknowledging that you're not conquering anything. You're asking permission to visit someone else's country. And step 2, Learn the local customs before you do anything stupid. Like, for instance, landing armed soldiers in the middle of somebody's front yard during mating season. Aria winced. Point taken, step 3. Find a good local guide who can keep you from getting killed while you figure things out. Someone who understands both the landscape and the locals, and who can translate between your way of thinking and ours. Someone like you. Cody's grin returned. Well, hypothetically speaking, I do know a thing or two about keeping city folk alive in the bush. Reckon I could extend that to keeping space folk alive on the planet. And what would such guidance cost? Oh, that's easy. I want front row seats when you meet your first drop bear. Aria's translation software couldn't parse that reference, but something in Cody's expression suggested she probably didn't want to know. Drop bear. Don't worry about it. We'll work up to the really dangerous stuff. First, let's focus on getting you through the day without any more impromptu boxing matches. As if summoned by his words, a massive shape appeared on the horizon, another kangaroo, but this one was different. Larger, moving with a fluid power that made even the big red male from earlier look moderate by comparison. Ah, said Cody, his tone shifting to something approaching respect. Now there's someone you want to meet. Another kangaroo. Not just any kangaroo, that's Boomer, the old man of the eastern grays. He's about 12 years old, which makes him ancient by kangaroo standards, and he's been the undisputed boss of this entire region for the past 6 years. Even from a distance, Aria could see that this kangaroo was built differently, taller, more muscular, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight and didn't expect to start now. He looks formidable. Mate Boomer could take on a small car and come out ahead. But here's the thing, if he accepts you, every kangaroo from here to the coast will know you're under his protection. You'll be able to travel anywhere in this region without worrying about territorial disputes. And if he doesn't accept us? Cody's expression grew thoughtful. Well, then you'll have learned a valuable lesson about the importance of first impressions. Probably while being educated in advanced kangaroo combat techniques. Boomer approached with measured hops, each landing covering impressive distance. The other kangaroos moved respectfully aside, forming a loose circle around the landing site. Even old Sheila seemed deferential to the approaching patriarch. Right, Cody said quietly, this is the big moment. Everything you've learned so far applies double with Boomer. No eye contact, no sudden movements, and absolutely no aggressive postures. He's going to want to establish dominance, so let him. Your job is to show respect without showing fear. How do we show respect to a kangaroo? Same way you'd show respect to any powerful bloke whose territory you've wandered into uninvited. Stand your ground, keep your head down, and wait for him to decide whether you're worth his time. Boomer completed his approach and rose to his full height, nearly 8 feet of pure muscle and controlled aggression. He studied Aria's squad with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to being the final authority on all local disputes. Then, unexpectedly, he looked directly at Cody and made a soft, chuffing sound. "G'day, you old bastard," Cody replied conversationally. "These are the new folks I was telling you about. They're still learning the ropes, but they're trying to be respectful." Aria stared in disbelief. "You know him. Boomer and I go way back, saved him from a fence tangle about 5 years ago, and he's been keeping an eye on me ever since. Kangaroos have long memories, especially for favors." The massive patriarch approached Aria directly, moving with surprising gentleness for something that could probably punch through a tank. He sniffed at her armor, tested the unfamiliar materials, and spent several long moments studying her weapons, now safely on the ground. Finally, Boomer stepped back and made a series of soft sounds that seemed almost conversational. "He says you smell like fear and metal, but you're learning to mind your manners," Cody translated with a straight face. "Also, he wants to know if you're staying long, because if so, you need to understand that the creek access is shared territory, and anyone who tries to claim it exclusively will be dealt with accordingly." "You can understand him." "Not exactly, but I've been reading kangaroo body language for most of my life. Plus, Boomer's pretty expressive when he wants to be." The old patriarch completed his assessment and turned away, hopping toward the creek with unhurried dignity. Almost immediately, the tension in the air dissipated completely. The various kangaroo groups began hopping away, their curiosity satisfied. "That's it?" Aria asked. "We passed inspection." "Looks like. Boomer's given you provisional acceptance as temporary residents. You can move around the territory without being challenged, as long as you stick to the rules and don't cause trouble." Aria looked around at the now peaceful landscape, trying to reconcile this outcome with her training in military occupation protocols. This isn't how conquests usually work. Well, good thing you're not conquering anything then, isn't it? Her comm unit crackled to life. Delta Squad, report status. Command is growing concerned about your prolonged silence. Aria exchanged glances with Cody, who was wearing his most innocent expression. Command, this is Delta Squad. We've established diplomatic contact with local power structures, requesting permission to extend negotiations while we assess long-term cooperation possibilities. Diplomatic contact with Kangaroos. With the regional territorial authority, Aria replied smoothly. It's more complex than our initial intelligence suggested. Static filled the channel for several long moments. Delta Squad, you have 72 hours for your diplomatic assessment. Command out. As the transmission ended, Aria found herself staring at the human who'd somehow transformed her invasion into a cultural exchange program. So, she said carefully, what exactly does one do during a 72-hour diplomatic assessment with kangaroos? Cody's grin was absolutely infectious. Well, first we're going to teach you how to cross a creek without starting a territorial incident. Then we'll work on reading weather signs, because getting caught in a storm out here is a good way to end your diplomatic career permanently. After that, he paused thoughtfully. After that, if you're really serious about this cooperation idea, I reckon it's time you met some of the other locals. Other locals? Oh yeah, see, kangaroos are just the welcome committee. If you want to understand Australia, you need to meet the real residents, the ones who have been calling this place home for 60,000 years. 60,000 years. Give or take. Aboriginal Australians, the original owners and operators of this continent. If you want to learn how to really live with this landscape instead of just surviving it, they're the ones to teach you. Aria felt her worldview shifting again. The Dominion's intelligence reports had mentioned Earth's various human populations, but had classified them all as primitive and unorganized. Suddenly, she was beginning to suspect that her species' definition of primitive might need some serious revision. Cody, she said slowly, exactly how wrong were our intelligence assessments? His laugh echoed across the red plains. Mate, you haven't even begun to discover how wrong you were. But don't worry, we've got 72 hours to start bringing you up to speed. As if to punctuate his words, a wedgie eagle circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. Even from the ground, Aria could see that the bird was massive, easily large enough to carry off one of her soldiers if it felt inclined. Let me guess, she said resignedly. That's another neighbor we should know about. Oh, that's just old Eagle-Eye Eddie, harmless mostly, though you might want to avoid wearing anything shiny when he's around. Wedgies are curious birds, and they've got a grip that can crush bone. Aria looked up at the circling predator, then across the landscape where kangaroos grazed peacefully in the distance, then at the human who seemed completely comfortable in a world that could kill him in a dozen different ways before lunch. I'm beginning to understand why the Dominion never successfully conquered Earth, she murmured. Oh, that's not why, Cody said cheerfully. See, the thing about Australia is it doesn't try to kill you. It just gives you plenty of opportunities to kill yourself through poor decision-making. The trick is learning to make good decisions. And you're going to teach us. Well, someone needs to. Can't have you lot wandering around the bush getting turned into abstract art by the locals. Bad for our reputation as hosts. As they gathered up the scattered equipment and began the long process of explaining to Orbital Command why their invasion had turned into a camping trip, Aria found herself thinking about the intelligence reports that had been so catastrophically wrong. They'd assessed Earth's defenses in terms of weapons, technology, military organization, all the traditional markers of resistance. They'd never considered that the planet's greatest defense might be the simple fact that its inhabitants had spent millennia learning to thrive in the company of creatures that could kill them without effort, in landscapes that demanded constant adaptation, under conditions that would break most civilized species. Earth didn't need weapons to defend itself. It had Australians, and apparently that was more than enough. 3 days later, Aria was beginning to understand that her 72-hour diplomatic assessment had been laughably optimistic. She sat cross-legged beside a small campfire, nursing a cup of something Cody called Billy tea that tasted like it had been filtered through eucalyptus bark and good intentions. Her armor bore new scratches from her introduction to Australian flora. Apparently even the trees here had opinions about strangers. So let me get this straight, she said, reviewing her notes on a battered datapad. In the past 3 days, I've learned that your continent contains Kangaroos that box, birds that can disembowel large predators, spiders whose venom can kill in 15 minutes, snakes that hunt in coordinated packs, plants that cause pain so severe that mammals have been known to commit suicide rather than endure it, and jellyfish that are essentially floating death incarnate. Box jellyfish, Cody corrected, poking at the fire with a stick. And you're forgetting the blue-ringed octopus, the stonefish, and the cone snails. Plus there's drop bears, though we haven't covered those yet. And your species not only survived evolving alongside all of this, but chose to stay and build a civilization here. Well, when you put it like that, it does sound a bit mad, Cody admitted. But see, the thing is, once you learn to read the signs and follow the rules, it's actually quite nice. Beautiful sunrises, clean air, plenty of room to think, and neighbors who'll leave you alone as long as you return the favor. Aria gestured toward a nearby rock where a large goanna was sunbathing, occasionally flicking its tongue out to taste the air. That neighbor there looks like it could eat one of my soldiers. Nah, Reggie's vegetarian mostly, though he might sample a finger if you offered. Goannas are curious about everything. Reggie. Well, I had to call him something. He's been coming around for years, always wants to investigate whatever I'm working on. Smart as paint, that one. Probably smarter than half the folks in Parliament. The goanna in question seemed to sense he was being discussed and turned one bright eye toward them, as if considering whether the conversation was worth joining. Your Parliament allows lizards as members. Mate, some days I think they'd do a better job than the current lot. Cody's grin took any sting out of the words. But speaking of politics, there's someone coming up the track who will want to meet you properly. Aria followed his gaze and saw a dust cloud approaching in the distance. As it drew closer, she could make out an ancient Toyota truck that seemed to be held together primarily by rust, prayer, and sheer bloody-mindedness. That'll be Mary, Cody said, standing and dusting off his jeans. Local elder, traditional owner of this country, and about the smartest person you'll meet between here and Darwin. If you want to understand Australia, she's the one to talk to. The truck wheezed to a stop near their campfire, and a woman emerged who looked like she'd been carved from the landscape itself. Elderly but moving with quiet strength, wearing practical clothes that had seen decades of outback sun, she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Cody, you old fool, she called out, but her voice carried warmth. What's this I hear about you adopting some lost tourists? G'day, Mary, these aren't tourists there. He paused, glancing at Aria. Well, it's complicated. Mary's dark eyes fixed on Aria with an intensity that made the alien suddenly understand why her species' intelligence assessments had been so inadequate. This woman was reading her with the same casual competence that Cody displayed when navigating the bush, seeing things that sophisticated sensors had missed entirely. Travelers from far away, Mary said finally, and it wasn't really a question. Very far away. Aria felt her translator struggling with the subtle implications in the older woman's tone. Yes, extremely far. And you came here thinking you knew what you'd find. It wasn't a question either, and Aria found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to answer. Mary settled beside the fire with the easy grace of someone who'd been making herself comfortable outdoors since before Aria's species had developed space travel. She accepted a cup of billy tea from Cody and studied the alien delegation with patient curiosity. First time visiting someone else's country, she asked. In a sense, yes. Thought so, you've got that look about you. Same look the tourists get when they realize the brochures didn't mention the flies. Mary's chuckle was dry but not unkind. Cody been teaching you the basics. Some of them we've learned about, territorial protocols with the local kangaroos. Ah, you met old Boomer, he give you the full inspection, did he? At Aria's nod, Mary smiled. Good. He's a fair judge of character, that one. If he let you stay, you must have shown proper respect. We're still learning what that means here. Fair enough, respect's different everywhere you go. What matters is being willing to learn. Mary sipped her tea thoughtfully. Cody tells me you're interested in cooperation rather than other approaches. Aria caught the delicate phrasing and realized that Cody had been more forthcoming about their original intentions than she'd expected. Yes, we've come to understand that our initial assessments were inadequate. Most first impressions are, country takes time to understand and longer to earn the right to call it home. Mary gestured toward the landscape around them. This place here, my people have been learning from it for 60,000 years, still learning new things every generation. 60,000 years, Aria repeated, trying to wrap her mind around that timescale. The Dominion's oldest colonies were barely 3,000 years old, give or take, long enough to figure out how to live with the land instead of fighting it. Course, that doesn't mean we stopped learning. Countries always got new lessons to teach. What kind of lessons? Mary's expression grew thoughtful. Well, take your arrival. 3 days ago, none of us knew people could come visiting from the stars. That's new. But the principles for dealing with strangers, for showing respect, for learning whether someone means harm or wants to build something good, those are old lessons. Same lessons we've been teaching for centuries. And those lessons apply to visitors from space. People are people, love. Doesn't matter if they walk on 2 legs or 4, or whether they come from the next valley over or the next star system. If they come in peace and show respect for the country and its people, there's always room at the fire. Aria felt something shifting in her understanding again. Your people have protocols for first contact with alien species. Mary laughed, a sound like wind through old trees. We've got protocols for first contact with anybody. Been dealing with strangers turning up uninvited for a couple hundred years now. Some came looking to take what wasn't theirs, some came looking to build something new. The principles for telling the difference haven't changed much. And which category do we fall into? Well, that's up to you, isn't it? You came here expecting to take. Now you're sitting at our fire asking about cooperation. That's a start. Cody had been quiet during this exchange, but now he leaned forward. Mary, they've got command ships up there full of soldiers who still think in terms of conquest. Aria here is trying to change some minds, but it's not going to be easy. Mary nodded slowly. Change never is, but country has ways of teaching people what they need to know if they're willing to listen. She looked directly at Aria. Question is, are your people willing to learn? I'm not sure. Some of us are beginning to understand that our approach was flawed, but the Dominion has protocols for dealing with primitive worlds that don't include adjustment. Primitive, Mary's eyebrow quirked upward. That's an interesting word. What makes a world primitive? Aria found herself struggling to articulate concepts that had seemed obvious just days before. Lack of advanced technology, limited space travel capability, decentralized political structures. So primitive means different from you. The gentle correction stung more than any direct challenge would have. I see your point. Do you? Because I'm looking at people who traveled between the stars but couldn't figure out how to land in kangaroo country without starting a fight. Makes me wonder about the relationship between advanced technology and practical wisdom. Cody snorted with amusement. Mary, you just summed up half the politicians in Canberra. Politicians everywhere, I'd guess. Mary's gaze never left Aria. See, the thing about wisdom is you can't download it or buy it or win it in a war. You have to earn it, usually by making mistakes and learning from them. Question for your people is whether they're humble enough to start learning. What would that learning look like? Mary considered this carefully. First thing would be acknowledging that you're guests here, not conquerors. Second would be understanding that being guests means following house rules, even if you don't understand them all yet. Third would be recognizing that the people who have been living here longest might have valuable things to teach. And if we can demonstrate those things, then maybe we can talk about what cooperation actually looks like. Real cooperation, not just a nicer word for taking what you want. Aria's comm unit chose that moment to crackle to life. Delta Squad, this is command. Your diplomatic assessment period expires in 18 hours. Prepare for extraction and full deployment briefing. The words dropped into the peaceful evening like stones into still water. Aria looked around at the fire, at Cody's worried expression, at Mary's knowing nod, at the vast landscape that had begun to feel like something she didn't want to leave behind. Copy command Delta Squad, requests extension for ongoing negotiations. Negative Delta Squad, the fleet requires your assessment to proceed with occupation protocols. Extraction in 18 hours is non-negotiable. Static marked the end of the transmission, leaving an uncomfortable silence around the fire. Well, said Mary finally, sounds like it's time to find out who your people really are. What do you mean? You've had 3 days to learn a different way of thinking. Now you get to find out if you learned anything, or if you're just tourists after all. Aria stared at the comm unit in her hands, then at the 2 humans who had somehow managed to completely overturn everything she thought she knew about warfare, diplomacy, and the nature of civilization. If I refuse the extraction order, that would be mutiny, Cody said quietly. Military types take that seriously, don't they? Very seriously. But if you follow orders, The Dominion proceeds with standard occupation protocols. My assessment will be dismissed as the result of extended exposure to primitive conditions causing compromised judgment. Mary poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Sounds like you've got a choice to make. Not much of a choice. There's always a choice, love. Sometimes none of the options are easy, but there's always a choice. Mary's voice carried the weight of long experience. Question is, what are you willing to stand up for? Aria looked around the fire again, seeing it now through different eyes. 3 days ago, this would have been a primitive gathering around an inefficient heat source. Now she saw it as something else entirely, a place where different kinds of people could come together with respect and shared purpose, where complicated problems could be worked through with patience and good faith. She thought about Boomer's measured assessment of her squad, about old Sheila's protective authority over her mob, about the complex social structures that her species' intelligence had dismissed as simple animal behavior. She thought about Mary's 60,000 years of accumulated wisdom, about Cody's easy competence in managing landscapes that would kill her soldiers in a dozen different ways. Most of all, she thought about the word primitive and how completely meaningless it had become. Mary, she said finally, if someone wanted to argue for a completely different approach to first contact, what would be the strongest case they could make? That's easy. Demonstrate that the different approach actually works. How? Mary's smile was slow and knowing. Well, that depends. How much do you trust your new friends, and how far are you willing to go to prove that there's a better way? Aria looked at the comm unit again, then at the 2 humans who had taught her more about diplomacy in 3 days than she'd learned in 15 years of military training. I'm about to find out, she said, and began composing a message that would either revolutionize the Dominion's approach to first contact or end her career in spectacular fashion. Possibly both. As she worked, she became aware of movement in the darkness beyond the fire. The soft sound of hopping, the rustle of grass, the small sounds of a country settling in for the night. But also something else, the sense of being watched by eyes that understood more than they let on. Boomer's out there, Cody said quietly. How do you know? Because when important decisions are being made in his territory, he likes to keep an eye on things. He's curious about what the space visitors are going to do next. Aria found the idea of a kangaroo taking interest in interstellar diplomacy both absurd and somehow perfectly appropriate. Any advice on what he'd want to see? Respect for the country, respect for the people, and maybe some evidence that you understand the difference between being a visitor and being an invader. Right, Aria took a deep breath and keyed her comm to broadcast on all frequencies. This is Combat Specialist Aria of the Dominion Fleet, transmitting on all channels for immediate relay to Command Authority. Static answered her, but she could feel the attention of listening devices, both technological and natural. I am formally requesting a complete suspension of Operation Earthfall pending comprehensive reassessment of first contact protocols. Current intelligence assessments are fundamentally flawed, and continued military action will result in tactical disaster and potentially catastrophic diplomatic consequences. The silence that followed was so profound that she could hear her own heartbeat. Then from somewhere in the darkness came the soft sound of kangaroo approval, or maybe just Boomer shifting position for a better view of the evening's entertainment. Furthermore, she continued, her voice growing stronger, I am requesting permission to establish formal diplomatic relations with local authorities under cultural exchange protocols. Initial negotiations indicate significant potential for mutually beneficial cooperation. Her comm unit exploded into static and competing voices as her transmission hit the fleet's communication networks. Delta Squad, clarify your status immediately. Combat Specialist Aria, report to extraction point for immediate disciplinary review. All units be advised that Delta Squad may be operating under compromised command authority. Mary reached over and gently took the comm unit from Aria's hands, switching it off with simple authority. Well, she said mildly, I'd say you just made your choice clear enough. I think I may have just started a mutiny. Or prevented a war, depends on how you look at it. Mary's expression was serious but not unkind. Course, now you've got to live with the consequences. Which are? Cody was grinning despite the gravity of the situation. Well, for starters, you're probably going to need a new job. On the bright side, I know some folks who could use help with a cultural exchange program. Cultural exchange. Teaching your people how to live here without getting killed by the locals. Teaching our people how to understand visitors from the stars, building bridges instead of walls. He gestured toward the darkness where Boomer was presumably conducting his own diplomatic observations. Reckon there's plenty of work for someone who speaks both languages. Aria felt something that might have been hope starting to build in her chest. You think it could work? Mate, 3 days ago you thought kangaroos were harmless herbivores and humans were primitive. If you can learn to read country well enough to earn Boomer's approval, I reckon anything's possible. As if summoned by the sound of his name, a large shape moved in the firelight's edge, the old kangaroo patriarch, hopping slowly into the circle of light with the measured dignity of someone joining an important discussion. Boomer settled on his haunches just outside the fire's warmth and regarded the 3 figures around the flames with what Aria had learned to recognize as kangaroo thoughtfulness. "What's he thinking?" she asked softly. "Hard to say for certain," Cody replied, "but if I had to guess, I'd say he's wondering whether the visitors from the stars are going to be the kind of neighbors worth having around." Aria looked at the massive marsupial, who had somehow become a key figure in interstellar diplomacy. Then at the 2 humans who had redefined her understanding of civilization itself, then up at the stars where her former colleagues were probably having heated discussions about court-martial procedures. "I suppose we'll find out together," she said. And far overhead, barely visible against the southern stars, a series of lights began moving in patterns that suggested the Dominion fleet was very much interested in continuing the conversation. The cultural exchange was about to get a lot more complicated. But as Mary poked the fire back to life and Cody started explaining the finer points of intergalactic diplomacy to a kangaroo who seemed genuinely interested in the proceedings, Aria found herself thinking that complicated might be exactly what they needed. After all, the best solutions usually were. The next morning brought visitors. Aria woke to the sound of atmospheric engines and the distinctly unhappy vocalizations of several kangaroo mobs who had opinions about uninvited aircraft disturbing their breakfast routine. She emerged from her improvised shelter to find Cody already up, binoculars trained on 3 Dominion atmospheric craft circling at what was probably considered a respectful distance. "Your mates don't seem too happy," he observed mildly. "No, they wouldn't be." Aria checked her weapons, still safely stowed as per kangaroo diplomatic protocol, and tried to assess the tactical situation with eyes that had learned to see differently over the past 4 days. "How are the locals taking it?" "Mixed reactions. Boomer and old Sheila have called a general assembly. The younger roos are curious but staying back. And Mary," he gestured toward the elderly woman who was calmly preparing tea as if alien spacecraft were an everyday occurrence. "Mary's waiting to see what kind of manners your people brought with them." One of the aircraft broke formation and began a careful descent toward their camp. Not the aggressive combat approach Aria had been trained to execute, but a cautious, almost hesitant landing pattern that suggested someone upstairs had been listening to her cultural briefings. "That's promising," she murmured. The craft touched down about 100 meters away, close enough for communication, far enough to avoid appearing threatening to the gathered marsupials. The door opened and 3 figures emerged. Commander Zax, her immediate superior, Negotiator Prime Kell, one of the Dominion's top diplomatic specialists, and to her surprise, Fleet Admiral Voss himself. Aria felt her stomach drop. When the fleet commander personally came planetside, it usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Should I be worried?" Cody asked, noting her expression. "That depends entirely on what kind of conversation they're planning to have." The delegation approached slowly, clearly aware they were being watched by dozens of kangaroo eyes. Admiral Voss himself was in full ceremonial armor, which would have been impressive if he hadn't been carefully stepping around kangaroo droppings and trying not to make eye contact with a large male who was blocking the direct path to the camp. "That's Buster," Cody provided helpfully. "Young buck, bit of a troublemaker. He's testing to see if your admiral understands basic politeness." Sure enough, Admiral Voss had stopped entirely, apparently unsure how to proceed past the kangaroo, who was showing every sign of being willing to discuss territorial rights in the traditional Australian manner. "Cultural exchange lesson number 1, Aria called out. Wait for him to move, don't try to go around him, don't make direct eye contact, and definitely don't try to push past. He's not blocking your way, he's just making sure you understand whose country you're walking through." The Admiral's expression suggested this was not the type of tactical situation covered in his training manuals. But after a moment's consideration, he stepped back and waited. Buster studied the armored figure for several long seconds, then hopped aside with what Aria had learned to recognize as kangaroo approval. "Interesting," Admiral Voss said as he approached the fire. "The local fauna is more, politically aware than our intelligence suggested. That's one way to put it, Aria replied carefully. Admiral, thank you for coming planetside personally. I believe there are some significant reassessments we need to discuss. Indeed, the Admiral's gaze took in the peaceful camp, the watching kangaroos, and the two humans who were observing the proceedings with obvious interest. Combat specialist, your communications yesterday were unexpected. Yes, sir, I felt the situation warranted immediate revision of our operational parameters. Revision? The Admiral's tone was perfectly neutral, which in Dominion military culture usually preceded either commendations or court-martial proceedings. Perhaps you could elaborate on what situation you've encountered that requires suspending a fleet-level operation. Aria glanced at Cody and Mary, both of whom nodded encouragingly. Sir, our fundamental assumptions about Earth's defensive capabilities, social structures, and strategic value were incorrect. Not partially wrong, completely, catastrophically incorrect. Negotiator Prime Kell stepped forward. Specialist preliminary orbital scans confirm minimal technological infrastructure and no significant military resistance. How could our assessment be incorrect? Before Aria could answer, Mary spoke up from beside the fire. Because you were looking for the wrong things, love. The Dominion delegation turned toward her with varying degrees of surprise. Admiral Voss's expression suggested he wasn't accustomed to being addressed casually by elderly human females. I beg your pardon, he said stiffly. Mary Gundera, she said, rising gracefully and extending a hand in the universal human gesture of greeting. Traditional owner of this country, and I suppose you could say local diplomatic representative. Admiral Voss stared at the offered hand for a moment before carefully accepting the greeting. Admiral Torvin Voss, commanding the Dominion Expeditionary Fleet. You're a government official. Mary's laugh was warm but knowing. Government's a strong word. Let's say I speak for the people who have been taking care of this place the longest. I see, the Admiral clearly didn't see at all, but was trying to maintain diplomatic courtesy. And your position is that you folks have been making assumptions about what makes a place worth defending and what makes people worth respecting. Mary settled back beside the fire and gestured for the delegation to join her. Might want to sit down, this could take a while. Admiral Voss looked uncertain about conducting fleet-level negotiations around a campfire, but Commander Zax was already moving toward the offered seats. As the ranking military specialist present, he'd clearly reached conclusions similar to Aria's. Admiral, Zax said diplomatically, I believe the local situation may be more complex than our initial assessment indicated. How so? Aria took a deep breath. Sir, Earth's primary defense isn't technological or military. It's adaptive. The dominant species here has spent hundreds of thousands of years learning to thrive in environments that would kill most of our troops within hours. They've developed social structures that prioritize cooperation and resilience over hierarchical control. And they've done it while coexisting with some of the most formidable combat fauna in the galaxy. Combat fauna, Negotiator Prime Kell looked skeptical. Our scans indicated standard evolutionary patterns for a garden world. Cody chose that moment to point toward the edge of the clearing, where Boomer was approaching with his characteristic measured dignity. Admiral, Aria said softly, that kangaroo there put 3 of my best soldiers in medical status with casual kicks. He's not a predator, not a war beast, not a trained combatant. He's a herbivore who was mildly annoyed that we'd violated local territorial protocols, and he's one of the gentler examples of local wildlife. Admiral Voss watched as the massive kangaroo settled nearby, clearly listening to the conversation with obvious intelligence. Furthermore, Aria continued, the human population has developed cultural and technological adaptations that our assessment protocols completely failed to recognize. They're not primitive, they're sophisticated in ways we never considered measuring. Such as, Mary gestured toward the landscape around them. 60,000 years of sustainable environmental management. Social structures that have survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, continental droughts, and a few hundred years of fairly intensive colonization attempts. Knowledge systems that can read weather patterns, water sources, and animal behavior with an accuracy that your orbital sensors can't match. And most importantly, Cody added with his characteristic grin, the kind of practical problem-solving skills that come from living in a place that's constantly trying to kill you in creative ways. Negotiator Prime Kell was taking notes on a datapad. These are interesting cultural observations, but I'm not sure how they affect strategic calculations for For conquest, Mary's voice remained pleasant, but something in her tone made everyone around the fire pay closer attention. See, that's where you've been thinking about this all wrong. You can't conquer Australia. Australia conquers you. I don't understand. This country changes everyone who tries to live in it. Sometimes it kills them, sometimes it teaches them, sometimes both, but nobody walks away unchanged. The question isn't whether you can take this place by force, it's whether you can earn the right to call it home. Admiral Voss was quiet for a long moment, studying the peaceful but watchful gathering of kangaroos, the two humans who spoke with easy authority about their landscape, and the combat specialist who had somehow transformed a military assessment into a cultural exchange program. Specialist Aria, he said finally, are you recommending that the Dominion abandon its expansion into this system? No, sir, I'm recommending that we reconsider what expansion means. Elaborate. Aria looked around the fire, drawing strength from the unlikely diplomatic assembly she'd somehow become part of. Sir, what if instead of conquest we pursued integration? What if instead of taking Earth's resources, we learned to contribute to its ecological and social systems? What if we approached this as potential partners rather than rulers? Partnership with a pre-spaceflight civilization. Admiral Cody interjected, with respect, you're still thinking about this backwards. We're not pre-spaceflight. We're post-necessity. We stopped needing to leave Earth because we learned to live with it properly. That's not primitive, that's advanced. The implications of that statement settled over the gathering like morning mist. Admiral Voss was clearly struggling to reconcile his understanding of civilization with the evidence in front of him. Furthermore, Mary added gently, you're assuming that spaceflight represents some kind of evolutionary advancement. But from where I sit, a species that has to keep leaving its home planets because it can't figure out how to live sustainably might be the one that needs to learn a few things. The silence that followed was broken by a soft, chuffing sound from Boomer, who seemed to approve of the direction the conversation was taking. Sir, Aria said carefully, I believe we have an opportunity here that goes far beyond resource acquisition. Earth's population has spent millennia developing exactly the kind of adaptive technologies and social systems that could solve some of the Dominion's most persistent challenges. What kind of challenges? Sustainable population management, environmental restoration, conflict resolution between competing territorial claims, long-term resource management. Aria was warming to her theme now. Every failed colony we've established, every resource war we've fought, every administrative crisis we've faced, the solutions are here. They're embedded in how these people live. Admiral Voss looked from Aria to Mary to Cody, then toward the landscape where kangaroos grazed peacefully in the morning sun. And in exchange for access to these solutions, what would Earth's population want from us? That's easy, Mary said with a smile that held 60,000 years of patient wisdom. The same thing anyone wants from their neighbors. Respect, cooperation, and the assurance that we're all working to build something better than what we started with. And if the Dominion agrees to this approach, then you're welcome to stay, Cody said simply. Not as conquerors, not as rulers, but as the newest residents of the best country in the galaxy. Fair warning though, this place will change you. It changes everyone eventually. And if we refuse? Mary's expression grew thoughtful. Well, that would be disappointing, but Australia's been here a long time. We've seen conquerors come and go. In the end, country always wins. Admiral Voss was quiet for several minutes, weighing options and implications that hadn't existed in any of his strategic planning documents. Finally, he turned to negotiator Prime Kell. Draft a formal proposal for cultural exchange and cooperative settlement protocols. Include provisions for technology sharing, environmental cooperation, and shared governance structures. Sir, Kell's voice carried obvious surprise. And prepare a full report for High Command explaining why the traditional conquest model is strategically inadvisable for this system. Yes, sir, Kell was taking notes rapidly. And our current fleet deployment will remain in system as a diplomatic mission rather than an invasion force. Admiral Voss stood, brushing dirt from his ceremonial armor. Specialist Aria, you're hereby appointed as Senior Cultural Liaison, reporting directly to Fleet Command. Your primary mission is to prevent the rest of us from making the kind of mistakes that get people killed by militant marsupials. Aria felt a grin spreading across her face. Yes, sir, I'll do my best to keep everyone alive while they learn the local customs. See that you do. The Admiral paused, looking around at the campfire gathering that had somehow redirected the course of galactic history. And specialist, good work. This is exactly the kind of creative problem solving we need more of. As the official delegation prepared to return to their craft, Admiral Voss paused for one final exchange with Mary. Mrs. Gundera speaking personally, do you believe this cooperation can work? Mary's smile was warm and knowing. Admiral, 3 days ago your people landed here thinking they were conquerors. Today they're sitting around our fire asking to be neighbors. If change can happen that fast in both directions, I reckon anything's possible. Even peaceful coexistence between kangaroos and alien invaders. Mate, Cody called out from beside the fire. If Boomer's willing to share his territory with space visitors, the rest is just paperwork. As if to emphasize the point, the old kangaroo patriarch rose to his full height, studied the departing delegation with obvious assessment, and then settled back down with what any reasonable observer would interpret as approval. 6 months later, the first Dominion Earth Cultural Exchange Center opened its doors in what had once been planned as a military command post. The facility featured kangaroo-friendly landscaping, traditional Aboriginal art installations, and a comprehensive orientation program for off-world visitors titled How Not to Get Killed by Australian Wildlife. A practical guide for galactic citizens. Aria, now holding the rank of cultural ambassador, split her time between teaching Dominion personnel the finer points of Earth ecology and helping human communities establish productive relationships with their new interstellar neighbors. The program's most popular course was Conflict Resolution, Lessons from Living with Combat Marsupials, which had become required training for Dominion diplomatic personnel throughout the galaxy. The second most popular was Sustainable Resource Management, what 60,000 years of environmental stewardship can teach us about long-term planning. But the real success of the program could be measured in smaller moments. Dominion engineers learning water conservation techniques from Aboriginal elders. Human artists collaborating with alien designers on architecture that worked with local weather patterns instead of against them. Children from both species growing up together, equally comfortable with advanced technology and traditional bush survival skills. And in the red heart of Australia, where it all began, an unlikely community had grown around the original campfire site. Humans and Dominion citizens worked together on projects that neither species could have accomplished alone. Atmospheric processors that enhanced rather than replaced natural weather patterns, communication networks that integrated traditional knowledge with advanced sensor technology, and transportation systems that accommodated both interstellar shuttles and territorial kangaroos. The centerpiece of the community was a circular meeting ground where all major decisions were made by consensus between human elders, Dominion representatives, and according to local protocol, the acknowledged territorial authority of one very old, very dignified kangaroo patriarch who had somehow become the galaxy's first non-human diplomat. Boomer's retirement was extremely comfortable and politically significant. On quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and the fire was built up against the desert night, Aria would sometimes look around at the impossible gathering of species and wonder if this was what the future of galactic civilization could look like. Not conquest or domination, but the patient work of learning to live together in the vast garden of the universe. No worries, mate, Cody would say whenever she shared these thoughts. If it works here, it'll work anywhere. Australia's never been easy, but it's always been fair. Treat it with respect, and it'll teach you everything you need to know. And far overhead, ships from a dozen worlds would pass through Earth's system, their crews already familiar with the legend of the planet, where a failed invasion had become the galaxy's most successful diplomatic revolution. The planet where even the grass-eaters knew how to fight, but chose instead to teach their former enemies how to call a dangerous place home. The planet where the first rule of citizenship was simple. Respect the country, respect the neighbors, and never, ever pick a fight with a kangaroo. It was a good place to learn how to live.